Hey y'all, this short video is going to introduce you to two key concepts in both literary and media studies, or intertextuality and adaptation. Most of us in 2023 probably spend more time interfacing with visual media than we do with traditional print media. And what I mean by that is we probably watch more movies, TV shows, Netflix series, etc., than we do poems, short stories, and novels. That's one of the reasons I'm using the word text here, because I think that those sorts of visual media are just as important as print media, and because we spend so much time with them, I want to give us some skills for bringing the tools of close reading that we've been developing through reading short stories and poems to bear on the visual media that we spend so much time with. Now, this celebrated American novelist Cormac McCarthy, who just passed away a few days ago, once said that the ugly truth is that books are made out of books. And what I think he means by that is that whenever an artist creates something, on some level, some of the works that that artist has read before or seen before, viewed before, whatever, are exerting an influence on the creative process. And you can figure out what that influence is if you read it really closely. So intertextuality describes the relationships between texts that sometimes the author creates on purpose. Sometimes the author wants us to think about the other texts that are being alluded to or referenced. You may have been watching a film or reading a book before, and you notice there is a kind of call out to another film or another book. And sometimes that's on purpose. Sometimes it's not on purpose, or sometimes the author didn't even know it happened, and sometimes we as audience members perceive that. But however it happens, intertextuality is about the ways that we can better understand a text by understanding the text that went into the making of it. What did the author have on his, her, or their mind when they went into this writing process? That's what intertextuality is at its base. Now, two of the key intertexts for Everything is Illuminated is Anthony Burgess's Clockwork Orange and Art Spiegelman's Mouse. Clockwork Orange, which you may have seen the Stanley Kubrick adaptation, the film version of that, is a sort of dystopian look at teenage violence in the 1970s. Art Spiegelman's Mouse was a highly celebrated comic book that investigates Art Spiegelman's father, who was a Holocaust survivor. He survived the death camp at Auschwitz. And both of these texts go into, in fundamental ways, informing how Everything is Illuminated thinks about both language and how we repurpose the past, and particularly how Holocaust literature might make use of history. Now, the main character of Clockwork Orange is someone named Alex, played by Andy McDowell, who you see on the left. One of the great innovations of Clockwork Orange is its use of language. Now, you'll see below, one of the quotes is, "Suddenly I viddied what I had to do and what I had wanted to do." Now, viddied isn't an English word. It's a word that the author made up that describes how this particular group of people uses language. It's a word that is imported from Russian, and it just means to see. Now, Alex and his friends call each other droogs, which is also another Russian word. And it's one of the ways that the novel is inventive and playful with language in very similar ways that we see happening in Everything is Illuminated. Now, our main character in Everything Illuminated, you see on the right, is, of course, Alex as well, also known as Sasha, to his grandfather. And this is one quote among many that you might pull out. "Make sure to secure the door when I am gone. I do not want to make you a petrified person, but there are many dangerous people who want to take things from Americans and also kidnap them. Okay, good night." So you can see a similar kind of use of language that's not importing words from other languages, but making language somewhat strained, making us pay more attention to it, drawing attention to itself as art. And that's one of the ways that Clockwork Orange is an intertext for Everything is Illuminated. Now, Art Spiegelman's Mouse is about the Holocaust survivor, and one of the conceits of that novel is that all of the characters are depicted as different animals. The Jewish characters are depicted as mice, the Nazis are depicted as cats, and that's part of the sort of allegory there. But as we talked about in the last video, a key component of Holocaust literature is the witnessing of the past, is bearing witness to what happened, to make sure we do not forget and to find ways to keep it in our minds and in our memories and in our imaginations. So on the left, you'll see this is Vladek, is Art Spiegelman's father, saying, "It's my eyes." He constantly, throughout the comic, is drawing attention to the eyes, what he saw, what happened at Auschwitz. And I think one of the things that Everything is Illuminated is playing with, particularly the film version, is Jonathan Safran Foer, the character played by Elijah Wood, has these oversized glasses that makes his eyes seem too big. Part of that, I think, is that because it's an intertext with Maus. It's thinking about how is this particular novel trying to bear witness in new and interesting ways to the Holocaust and to that particular history. Moving on to adaptation, these are Oxford English Dictionary definitions, but the definition on the left is sort of the familiar biological idea of adaptation, or how organisms change and modify over time, which in some ways can help us understand how certain media become other media, how books are made out of other books or films are made out of other films. But on the right, we see a literary definition of adaptation, or an altered or amended version of a text, composition, etc., when adapted for a different medium. What adaptation studies does is says sort of what does one medium allow for, like what does a book sort of do, and how do we make a similar version of that in a film? How do we take the original text and make it into a new text that takes full advantage of what that new text does, or that new medium does? Many of you have probably read The Hunger Games or seen the film version, so this is one example of adaptation from a book to a film. Or returning to Cormac McCarthy, you may have read the book version of No Country for Old Men, or seen the Coen brothers adaptation, No Country for Old Men. So the first issue we really face in adaptation studies is what's called fidelity, or being faithful to the source. Many people who love a particular series, maybe you love Harry Potter or The Hunger Games or something like that, and then when you see it in a new form, you'll notice that there are changes, right? So what does it mean to be faithful to that source? And is being faithful always a good thing? Or should we be able to make changes based on what a film can do versus what a book can do? So the first paradigm that adaptation studies deals with is what's called translation. It's the idea that you can take a novel and make it sort of one for one into a film. And that's what the adaptation is sort of understood as a reproduction of that original text, based on the idea of, like, you may take a sentence or a book or something like that in one language and turn it to another language, and the idea is to make it as close as possible, right? So this is a paradigm that privileges fidelity. It says, above all things, the new adaptation should be a new version of the old thing. It should be faithful to the letter of the text upon which it's based, and what that means is that it tries to reproduce every element of that possible. That is sometimes not possible, but a lot of people come to adaptation studies with this as their baseline assumption. The next paradigm, rather than simply trying to adapt everything kind of letter for letter, word for word, part for part, is what's called a pluralist approach. So rather than trying to retain everything from the original, this focuses on the ability to retain the spirit of the original, organized around what are called kernels, or what are those key elements that make this story different from other stories? What are the elements that can't be omitted without dramatically changing the story, right? So you may think about what is the mood, the tone, the characterization, the plot of the original, and how do we make that work in a different medium. Now, this allows the adaptation, the director, the author, whatever is behind the new adaptation, to have some kind of autonomy, to make decisions, to make changes based on what he, she, or they thinks is best for that particular adaptation. This requires a degree of interpretation. You have to almost put a reading of the novel. You have to create an argument about what are the most important points, what are the most important parts of it, and then that's what you keep as you turn into the new version. And finally, we have the transformation approach. This says basically that whatever is in the original text, we can change whatever we need in the new text. That the original text is only raw material, and it can be altered as significantly as possible. This approach says that the original text, the novel, for example, is not as important as the new text. It's a sort of radical change from what we most think of as adaptation studies, which should be privileged in a kind of translation or adaptation of a text. And it acknowledges that media are different kind of sign systems. And what that means is that the way that a novel makes sense is very different from the way the film makes sense, and that you should try to use the film in the best way possible and not be tethered to, not be obligated to that original text in any way, shape, or form. So as you're thinking about adaptation, you should think about the way that different media have these different sign systems or ways of making meaning. They have different affordances. What does a certain medium or technology do, and how can we use it? For example, in a novel, we have dialogue, we have description, we can have first-person narration. There are all these things that we can do, but there are things that work just differently in a film, right? There are also constraints to those media, or what a medium or technology struggles to do. This is even true of non kind of literary or aesthetic media, right? Like you could think about what your cell phone does and what it struggles to do. You can even think about what a doorknob does and struggles to do. But one way we might think about this is the quote at the bottom. In a novel, for example, the narrator controls the only track, which is the verbal track. In a film, the narrator can partially control the verbal track through a kind of voiceover, but that control is subject to innumerable constraints. In a film, the other characters instantly gain a physical presence denied them in the novel. So if we think about this, that scene of Everything Illuminated, where Alex, his grandfather, Jonathan, Sammy Davis Jr., all in the car. In the novel, it's just Alex and Jonathan talking. That's fine for a novel because that's its affordance. One of its constraints is that while they're talking, it doesn't necessarily describe what everyone else is doing. However, in a film, you have to have all those characters in the frame, or at least present in that scene, very differently than you do in a novel. Of course, adaptation studies also has other arenas in which it works, such as cultural artifacts to film. You may not know this, but the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise started out as a ride at Disney World, right? So you can also take a particular place, thing, ride, and make it into more than that as well. If you're familiar with the show The Office, that started out as a British comedy. And when it became an American comedy, it had to find a new ecological niche. British culture is slightly different. Their office culture is slightly different. So when they remediated that, adapted that into American audience or for an American audience, they had to make a lot of changes. We'll also see that when we read the last text of the semester, or the Confessions of Nat Turner, the historical account of this slave rising, and then the 2005 comic version of that by Kyle Baker. This is taking on a different set of adaptation studies questions, but I hope this brief overview will help you to understand both the film and the novel versions of Everything Illuminated, and also prep you for the kind of thinking that we'll have to do for Nat Turner later in the semester. Thanks for listening, and let me know if you all have any questions. Thanks.